Okay, so you want to build a navy. Buy some ships, put them in the water, paint them gray, and let the rest of the world quietly adjust its behavior. You picture the flight deck at dawn, a carrier sliding out of the harbor with the tugs peeling away, destroyers falling in behind it, a submarine somewhere underneath that nobody can find. You picture a line on a map, and the understanding that things happen on your side of that line only if you allow them to. You picture a country that gets phone calls returned. That's what a navy is supposed to buy you, not profit, but leverage, the kind that shows up in trade negotiations and shipping insurance rates and the tone people use when they talk to you. That's the picture. The picture is not slightly optimistic. It's wrong. And it's wrong in the same specific way for every country that has tried this in the last 100 years. And the moment of discovery usually arrives around year 8, when the ships exist, the flags are flying, and almost none of them can go anywhere. Let's start with what you think you're buying. An aircraft carrier is the number everyone knows. The newest American ones run somewhere around $13 billion for the lead ship, and about $11 to $12 billion for the ones that follow. That's a number people repeat at dinner parties, and it's the wrong number, because a carrier by itself is a very expensive parking lot. What makes it a weapon is the air wing, and the air wing is bought separately, out of a different account, which is how the true cost gets hidden in plain sight. Call it 60 to 75 aircraft, fighters at roughly $100 million each, airborne radar aircraft north of $200 million each, helicopters, tankers, electronic attack jets. Add it up honestly, and the air wing costs about as much as the ship it lands on. So the carrier isn't $13 billion. It's closer to 25 before it has a reason to exist. And it can't sail alone. A carrier without escorts is a target with a very good cafeteria. You need 4 to 6 destroyers at roughly $2.5 billion apiece, an attack submarine somewhere out ahead at $4 to $5 billion, and a replenishment oiler behind the whole formation carrying the fuel and food, because none of the escorts have the range to do a deployment without being fed at sea. That escort package is another $15 billion. So one deployable carrier strike group, 1, is about $40 billion of steel and airplanes. Not the annual cost. The purchase price, before a single sailor is paid. Now, most countries look at that and make the sensible decision. They skip the carrier. They buy a frigate navy. 12 modern frigates, air defense radar, a helicopter each, a few submarines, some patrol vessels for the coastline. A modern European frigate runs somewhere between $800 million and $1.5 billion, depending on how much of the electronics you build yourself. 12 of those, plus 4 conventional submarines at $1 billion each, plus support ships, and you're at $20 billion for a navy that can defend your own water and contribute a ship to somebody else's coalition twice a decade. $20 billion. It sounds like a lot. Here's the part that matters. It's the cheapest part of the entire project. Because the purchase price of a warship is not the cost of a warship. It's the deposit. The working rule in naval budgeting is that buying the ship is roughly 1/3 of what the ship costs you over its life, and operating it is the other 2/3. Warships live a long time. 30 years is normal, 50 happens. Every single one of those years, the ship consumes fuel, spare parts, dry dock time, ammunition for training, software updates, and a crew that has to be recruited, trained, housed, fed, medically insured, and eventually paid a pension. A $2.5 billion destroyer costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $80 to $100 million a year to own and operate with its crew aboard. Run that for 35 years, and you've spent more keeping it than you spent building it. Considerably more. Which means the day you sign for a warship, you have not bought a warship. You've signed a 35-year standing order, and the ship was just the first invoice. The ones after that arrive whether you use it or not, whether there's a war or not, whether the government that ordered it still exists or not. And somewhere in the middle of that standing order, the largest single invoice of the ship's life arrives, and it isn't for a weapon. Halfway through its service, a warship has to be taken apart. Not overhauled in the ordinary sense, opened up. The wiring is obsolete. The combat system is 3 generations behind. The pumps have run for 2 decades, and the whole vessel has to be brought up to a standard that didn't exist when it was designed. On a nuclear carrier, this is the midlife refueling and complex overhaul, and it costs somewhere in the region of $3 billion and takes about 4 years. 4 years. Read that as an owner and not as a taxpayer. For 4 years, you own a $13 billion carrier. You pay to keep a large fraction of its crew. You pay the yard, and the ship generates exactly 0 days of presence anywhere on Earth. On a fleet of 11 carriers with 1 or 2 in overhaul at any moment, you are permanently operating a 10-carrier navy while paying for 11. And every hull takes its turn in that hole. The same logic runs down the whole fleet in smaller denominations. A destroyer's midlife modernization runs into the hundreds of millions and takes it out of service for a year or more. Skip it, and the ship becomes technically alive and operationally useless. A hull with a radar that can't see what's being flown at it now, which is the most expensive kind of ship there is, because it still costs full price to own. And here's where it gets interesting, because that spending doesn't buy you what you assume it buys you. You'd think that if you own 12 ships, you have 12 ships. You do not. You have 3. Every navy on Earth runs on the same arithmetic, and it's brutal in its simplicity. At any moment, a ship is doing one of 3 things. It's deployed, actually out there, on station, doing the job. It's in maintenance, in a shipyard, torn open, with parts of it on a pier under a tarp. Or it's in the workup cycle, back from maintenance, crew half new, running trials and exercises and certifications until the ship is legally and practically ready to be sent somewhere that matters. The best navies in the world sustain about a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 hulls to keep 1 hull forward. Push harder than that, and you don't get more presence. You get broken ships and sailors who resign. Deployments run long, maintenance gets deferred. The next workup cycle takes longer because the ship came back in worse condition. And within about 4 years, the ratio quietly slips to 4-to-1, and you've made the problem worse by trying to solve it. Run that against the American fleet, and the fog clears fast. Roughly 300 battle force ships. On a normal day, about a third of them are at sea. Something like 60 or 70 are actually deployed forward, where a deployment means anything. The rest are tied up, torn open, or training. That's not dysfunction. That's the physics of the thing working correctly. So if you want 2 carriers permanently on station, 1 in one ocean, 1 in another, always, no gaps, you don't buy 2 carriers. You buy 6 or 7. At $40 billion each with the air wing and escorts. That's the real price of the sentence, we maintain a continuous presence. This is where the first trap opens, and it's political rather than naval. Hulls are visible. A ship gets launched with a band playing and a politician breaking a bottle on the bow, and a photograph that runs in every newspaper in the country. Availability is invisible. Nobody holds a ceremony for a dry dock renovation. Nobody gets re-elected for funding the spare parts inventory. So when the budget tightens, and it always tightens, the money comes out of maintenance and sustainment. Because deferring maintenance produces no headline, no protest, and no visible consequence for approximately 1 budget cycle. It produces an enormous consequence about 6 years later, just not to the person who made the decision. Now here's the other side of the ledger, and it's the one that ends more naval ambitions than any enemy has. The most strategically valuable object in a navy is not a ship. It's a hole in the ground full of water. A dry dock is where ships get fixed. Not painted, fixed. Hull work, propeller shafts, sonar domes, reactor work, anything below the waterline. And a dry dock big enough for a modern warship is a piece of civil engineering that takes years to build, costs billions, and cannot be improvised. The United States runs its nuclear fleet maintenance out of 4 public shipyards, and all 4 of them are older than powered flight: Norfolk, Portsmouth, Puget Sound, Pearl Harbor. Their basic layouts were designed for ships that no longer exist, arranged around a workflow that made sense when hulls were smaller and welding was new. The program to modernize them was originally budgeted around $21 billion over 2 decades, and the estimates have gone up sharply since, in the way that estimates do when you're rebuilding a working shipyard without shutting it down. Here's what that scarcity produces. A meaningful share of the American attack submarine fleet, routinely something like a quarter to a third of it, is not at sea, not training, not available. It is sitting in maintenance or waiting in line for maintenance, idle. Some boats have waited years for a dock slot. Sit with that for a second, because it's the purest expression of naval economics there is. You bought a $4 billion submarine. You are paying its crew every month. You are paying the shore infrastructure that supports it. The submarine is fully funded, fully manned, fully yours, and it can't leave because there isn't a place to fix it, and there won't be for another 18 months. Your capability is not limited by your fleet, it's limited by your calendar. You can order more submarines. You cannot order more dry docks and expect them next year. Which brings us to the part of naval economics that almost nobody outside the industry understands. And it's the part that decides whether a country actually gets to have a navy at all. You are not buying ships from a market. There is no market. One American shipyard can build an aircraft carrier. One. 2 yards can build destroyers. 2 can build nuclear submarines. That's the entire supplier base for the largest naval budget in human history. And on the other side of the table, there's exactly one customer. Because you cannot sell a spare destroyer to anyone who wanders in. One buyer, 1 or 2 sellers. That is not a market, it's a marriage. And in that arrangement, price is not set by competition. It's set by negotiation, by cost accounting, and above all by the fact that both sides know the yard has to survive. Because if the yard goes under, it does not come back. The cranes can be sold. The workforce cannot be reassembled. A shipyard is not a building. It's a few thousand people who know how to weld high-strength steel to a tolerance that keeps a hull intact at depth. And the only way to produce that person is to have them do it for years, next to someone who did it for 20. So the strangest line in the ledger is this. You are not just buying ships, you are paying to keep your suppliers alive. That's an actual, deliberate, enormous expense. Governments order hulls they don't urgently need in order to prevent a production line from going cold, because a cold line is more expensive than a wasteful one. The reason is the learning curve, and it's the most underrated number in this entire business. The first ship of a class costs dramatically more than the fifth, often something like 1.5 to 2 times as much. Not because the design changes, but because the workers learn. They learn the sequence, they stop redoing work, they build the jigs, they find where the pipe run actually goes instead of where the drawing said. By the 5th hull, the same yard with the same people builds the same ship for a fraction less, faster. Stop for 4 years to save money, and the welders take jobs in commercial construction. When you restart, you're not resuming at hull 5. You're back at hull 1, paying the first ship premium all over again, on a design that's now out of date. The pause saved you a few billion in the year of the pause, and cost you more than that permanently. That's the trap almost nobody sees coming. In most industries, you can pause. Demand comes back, you hire again, you resume. In shipbuilding, a pause deletes the capability, and the capability was the asset. The hulls were just what it produced. And this is where the international comparison stops being about patriotism and becomes about accounting. China builds warships faster and cheaper than the United States does. The reason usually given is cheap labor, and that's mostly wrong. The real reason is overhead absorption. Chinese yards build a huge share of the world's commercial shipping, container ships, tankers, bulk carriers, an enormous, continuous, profitable flow of steelwork. That commercial business pays for the dry docks. It pays for the cranes, the steel supply chain, the welding schools, the cutting robots, the whole fixed cost of an industrial base. Warships get built alongside it, absorbing the marginal cost of a plant that's already paid for. American yards build essentially no commercial ships, a fraction of 1% of world tonnage. So every dollar of overhead in an American naval yard is carried by one customer ordering 1 or 2 hulls a year. The dry dock isn't shared with a container ship program. The welder isn't trained on a tanker before touching a destroyer. Nothing is amortized against anything. That is the whole gap. Your rival isn't subsidizing his warships. He's building cargo ships for the world economy and getting warship capacity as a byproduct. You're paying full retail for an industrial base that sits half idle between orders. Same steel, same physics, completely different cost structure, and no amount of defense budget fixes it, because the problem is on the commercial side of a ledger the defense budget doesn't touch. Now let's talk about the people, because the ships are the easy part. Personnel is roughly a third of a large navy's budget, and it's the least compressible third. A modern warship needs a crew for every one of its 30 or 40 years, and that crew has to be recruited from an 18 to 24-year-old population that has other options, trained for 1 to 3 years in skills that are worthless to them anywhere else, retained through a decade of leaving home for 6 to 9 months at a time, and then paid a pension for the rest of their life. An American carrier carries around 3,000 ships company, plus roughly 2,500 more in the air wing. You are not operating a vessel. You are operating a town, permanently, on the ocean, with a 20-year retirement obligation attached to every resident. And when recruiting misses, which it has, badly, in several Western navies over the past few years, by thousands of sailors annually, you don't get a slightly smaller navy. You get ships you cannot sail. Watch what navies do when that happens, because it tells you everything about what they actually value. The United States retired most of one class of small surface combatants after less than a decade of service. Ships that cost $500 million and more decommissioned younger than many of the sailors standing on them. The propulsion had problems, the promised mission equipment never really arrived, and crucially, the crews were needed elsewhere. The United Kingdom pulled 2 large amphibious assault ships out of service, capable, expensive vessels, and retired frigates early, explicitly to free up sailors and money for other hulls. Nobody sank those ships. Their owners looked at the ledger and concluded that a ship you can't crew is worse than no ship, because a ship you can't crew still costs money and still occupies a dock. That's what it looks like when a navy admits it's cheaper to throw a warship away than to man it. So far, the fleet sounds expensive, but at least functional. Here's the part that makes the whole thing fragile. Modern warships fight out of a fixed magazine. A destroyer carries somewhere around 96 vertical launch cells, and each cell holds one weapon: air defense interceptor, land attack cruise missile, anti-submarine weapon. You choose the mix before you leave port, and that mix is your entire war. 96 is a big number right up until you meet the arithmetic of an actual engagement, where a single incoming threat may be worth engaging with 2 interceptors, because one shot at 85% reliability is a gamble you don't take with a $5 billion ship and 300 lives. And when the cells are empty, they're empty. Reloading them at sea, with a rolling deck and a missile canister that has to be lowered vertically into a hole with inches of clearance, has historically been something navies simply could not do. The solution has been to leave. Sail days back to a port with the right crane and the right stockpile, reload, sail days back to station. Your most capable warship removes itself from the fight not because it was hit, but because it ran out. Now put the price tags on it. The interceptors that protect a ship run from a couple of $1 million each up past $30 million for the high-end ballistic missile versions. The things being shot at them, increasingly, are drones that cost $20,000 to $50,000, built from commercially available parts, launched in quantity by people who don't have a navy at all. Everything about that trade goes your way tactically. The drone dies, the ship survives, and every single time it happens, you spend $2 million to destroy $50,000 worth of hobby aircraft, and the other side happily makes that trade all day, because their production line runs on a factory floor, and yours runs on a defense procurement schedule where interceptors are built at a rate of a few hundred a year across all types. That's the number that should stop you. A few hundred a year. A sustained month of serious shooting can burn through more interceptors than the entire industrial base produces in a year or two. The magazine on the ship is not the magazine. The factory is the magazine. And nobody builds a factory for a war that hasn't started, because a missile plant running at full capacity in peacetime produces an enormous inventory of expiring munitions and a very unhappy finance ministry. So where does a navy's money actually go? Not where you'd think, and not where the photographs point. The glamorous fleet is the visible fleet. The real fleet is the tail. The oilers that refuel destroyers underway, the ammunition ships, the repair tenders, the sea lift hulls that carry an army's vehicles and fuel across an ocean. That fleet is old, unglamorous, and chronically underfunded, because no legislature has ever been excited about a tanker. Large parts of Western sea lift capacity are decades past what any commercial operator would consider a sensible retirement age, and some of it has been sidelined, not for lack of ships, but for lack of qualified merchant mariners to crew them, a profession that shrank alongside the commercial shipping industry that used to produce it. Without that tail, your beautiful strike group has a combat radius roughly equal to how far it can go and still get home. A navy is a logistics organization that occasionally shoots. Everything else is the part you're allowed to photograph. Which brings us to how navies actually die. It isn't in battle. Almost none of them die in battle. They die on a spreadsheet over about 15 years through a sequence so ordinary that nobody involved does anything obviously wrong. It starts with a flat budget. Not a cut, flat. And shipbuilding costs rise faster than general inflation, consistently, because the labor is specialized, the supply chain is thin, and there's no productivity revolution coming for the business of welding thick steel in a confined space. So a flat budget is a shrinking navy every single year, silently, without a vote. Then the fleet ages together. Navies buy in blocks, 20 hulls over a decade, because that's how production efficiency works, which means they retire in blocks too. 35 years later, an entire generation of ships hits the end of its life within a few years of itself, and the bill for replacing all of them arrives at once, in the same decade as the midlife refits of everything else. This wave is visible from 20 years out. Everyone in the building can see it coming, and it consistently arrives anyway, because the budget that would have smoothed it belonged to a government that had other priorities. Then in the squeeze, the fleet does exactly what it's incentivized to do. It protects the new construction program because canceling ships is a headline and a lost industrial base. It pays for that by deferring maintenance and cutting spare parts and stretching deployments, which makes the existing ships less available, which means the ships that are available deploy longer, which breaks them faster, which pushes more of them into a maintenance queue that already has a 2-year wait. And so you arrive at the destination, a country spending record amounts of money on its navy, with fewer usable ships than it had 20 years earlier, and a shipbuilding plan whose independent cost estimates run a third higher than the official ones. Nobody sank anything. Nobody lost a war. The fleet was decommissioned, one press release at a time, on ordinary Tuesdays. So step all the way back and ask the question this whole thing is built on. What does a navy actually produce? Not profit, not territory. It produces two things, and both of them are strange. The first is presence. Ship days on station, in a specific piece of ocean, visible to everyone who cares. That presence changes what other people decide to do, how a shipping company routes a tanker, how an insurance underwriter prices a hull, how a foreign ministry phrases a demand. It's real. It's measurable in the price of freight and the flow of trade. And it's completely invisible in your own accounts, because it shows up as things that didn't happen. No navy has ever been able to prove what it prevented. The second thing it produces is time, and this is the one that matters. A carrier takes something like 7 to 10 years from the first cut of steel to the day it's actually useful. A nuclear submarine? 7 to 9. A new class of anything? Closer to 20 from concept to a squadron of them at sea. The crew that sails it needs a decade to produce a chief petty officer who knows what he's doing. The yard that builds it needs a generation to produce the welders and the pipe fitters and the nuclear qualified inspectors. Add it up, and the lead time on a navy is somewhere between 15 and 25 years, and there is no amount of money that compresses it. A wartime budget cannot buy you a submarine in 18 months. It can only buy you the submarine that somebody ordered 15 years ago, in peacetime, when it was politically expensive and strategically unprovable, and there was a hospital that wanted the money. That's the entire product. That's the whole thing you're paying for. If you decide to build a navy, be clear about the transaction. You are not buying ships. Ships are the receipt. You are buying a 20-year head start against a threat you cannot yet name, from a workforce that has to exist before you need it, in dry docks that have to be dug before the emergency, funded by governments that will never get credit for it and will be gone before anyone finds out whether they were right. The line on the map isn't drawn by the fleet. It's drawn by the decisions somebody made 15 years before the fleet showed up.